going to take a little trip. A journey, if you will. Now, the interesting thing about this journey is it has no specific beginning or end. It's more like a bus or a subway system, where you can jump on or off whenever you like. Now, we're going to start our journey today here, at Ross Bay Cemetery in Victoria, British Columbia. Now, I know it may seem like a bit of a sad place to start a great journey, but it's actually somewhere we'll come back to often. Because you never know where you'll end up when you start traveling. After all, it's one big world out there.
Here we go, right now. There is nothing to restrain us. There's no reason to refrain from building trains that will derail us. Here we go, right now. There is no one to rely on. We have hired a crew of Cylon slaves to hide inside our silos. Here we go. I haven't seen a team more ill prepared. We're halfway there. I haven't lied convincingly enough. We'll take you with us. Here you go.
While some people may associate cemeteries only with death, they're actually great places to learn about history. After all, history is just a record of people and events of times past. Now you can either read about that record in a book, or you can come here and see a living, or in this case not so living, history. Each gravestone has a million stories to tell, because underneath it is a person who also had a million stories. Who were these people? What did they do? Who were their friends? Where did they travel? Why are they here? These are the questions I want you to ask yourself as we take our journey. The first part of our journey begins here, at Block L of Ross Bay Cemetery, bordering Dallas Road and right near the water. Now, Ross Bay Cemetery is divided up into various blocks, and back in the 1800s, different cultural groups and religious groups were buried in different areas. Catholics buried here, Anglicans here, Presbyterians here. Which brings us back to Block L. Now, this was set aside as general usage, but it turns out a lot of people from China and various other parts of Asia were buried here. But looking around today, it's really hard to find a Chinese gravestone. There's a number of Japanese markers scattered around, but you really have to search to find a Chinese one. Now, there's two reasons for this. The first is that back in the early 1900s, it was a common Chinese practice to dig up the bones after 7 years and send them back to China so they could be buried there with the family. The second is that after 1903, most Chinese were buried at the new Chinese cemetery at Harling Point, here in Oak Bay. Now, there was still lots of room at Ross Bay at the time, so our first why question is, why would somebody build a brand new cemetery when there was still room left at the old Ross Bay? Well, to answer that, we'll have to look at where most of the Chinese were buried at Ross Bay Cemetery. Well, Dallas Road didn't always used to be here, and the cemetery actually came all the way down to the water. Well, right now it looks pretty calm, but Victoria can get some nasty storms and the waves can get pretty terrible. Well, back in the 1800s and early 1900s, there was no Dallas Road, no rocks, and no seawall, just earth. Now imagine you've got winter storms bashing water against the bare earth. What's going to happen? Now imagine you've got graves buried in that bare earth. What's going to happen now? That's right. As the winter storms bashed away the earth, the graves were gradually exposed, and prior to 1911, when the seawall was built, there was many stories of graves of coffins floating out to sea, and children playing in the bones that had washed up on shore. Now, an even bigger why question you should be asking yourself is, why is there a Chinese cemetery here in the first place? I mean, Victoria and China are a fair distance apart. There's a really big ocean in between. Well, for that matter, you might want to ask yourself, why is there a European cemetery here? But that's another journey for another day. Let's focus on the Chinese for now. Well, if you need a place to bury Chinese, it stands to reason that there's probably a large population of Chinese living somewhere in the area. Which brings us here, Victoria's Chinatown. The first Chinese immigrants arrived in Victoria in 1858. Now initially most came north from San Francisco, then later directly from China. Now in history there's something called push-pull factors, which means when a large number of people leave their homes and move to another place, it's usually for two reasons. Something's pulling them towards the new place, and something's pushing them away from their homes. Well, there was two big pull factors encouraging the Chinese to come to BC. At the beginning it was the search for gold, then later, jobs working on a new railroad that the government was building. And the push factors encouraging them to leave their homes? Well, that's another journey for another day. Now before we talk about the gold, let's have a look around Victoria's Chinatown. I'd like to tell you that Chinatown was always the great place that you see here, but it wasn't. I'd also like to tell you that when the Chinese immigrants started arriving in the summer of 1858, they were warmly welcomed, but they were not. The Chinese were greeted with a lot of racism when they arrived at the colony of Vancouver Island. However, two Chinese businessmen from San Francisco bought some property here at Pandora, then called Cormorant Street, which was outside the city center, and built some shacks to house other Chinese who were soon to arrive in large numbers. Others also built housing, and less than 5 years later, there were over 300 Chinese living in Victoria. Hence, Chinatown was born. In the beginning, Chinatown was little more than a collection of wooden shacks. But during a building boom between 1890 and 1910, most of the shacks were replaced by the brick buildings you see here today, many of which still bear the signs of their birthdays. Chinatown was a mystery to most non-Chinese Victorians, and the majority of the early Chinese population were single male workers, and Chinatown reflected this bachelor community. Small living quarters, stores, restaurants, cafes, opium factories, herbalists, and this place, Fantan Alley. Fantan was quite a popular gambling game in China at the time, and there were a number of Fantan clubs in this alley, hence giving its name, Fantan Alley. The game works like this. Fan means to turn over, and tan means to spread out. Now you need 4 things to play the game. 1, a cup. 2, a bunch of buttons or other counters. I'm using dimes here. A stick to count the buttons with. And this special board numbered 1 to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The game would begin like this. The dealer, we'll call him, would take a handful of buttons, place them in the cup, then turn the cup over. There's your fan. Next, the betting would begin. Now, if you wanted to pick one number, place your bet on the side of the board. If you wanted to pick 2 numbers, you'd place your bet on the corner of the board. Once all the bets were placed, the cup would be raised and the counters spread out. There's the tan. Then the dealer would start counting off sets of 4 buttons. Until he got to the last few buttons. This would be the winning number, in this case 2. Now if you bet on the side and you picked one number, the payout was 3 to 1. So if I bet $10, I'd make 30. If you bet on the corner, the payout was even money. So if I bet $10, I'd make $10. Of course, the owner of the Fantan Club would always take his cut, usually about 10%. So if I made $30, I'd actually make 27. And if I won $10, I'd actually really win 9. Fantan Alley evolved as buildings went up between Pandora and Fisgard. Now, while gambling wasn't exactly legal in those days, police didn't try and stop it, but they did hold frequent raids to try and control it. Therefore, you had to pass through several gates and doors, plus a watchman before you were allowed into the alley. The alley was so secretive that Victoria's non-Chinese population didn't know about it for years. Now, in 1940, there was a world war that included China, but that's another journey for another day. Because of this war, Chinese in Victoria couldn't send money back to China. As a result, there was a boom in business in Fantan Alley. With lots of money, lots of people, and lots of gambling going on, plus frequent police raids, it was a good idea to have an escape route planned out. Now, with hidden exits, double doors, blind alleys, and dead ends, Chinatown was a virtual maze to anyone who didn't live here, allowing Chinese to frequently escape the police raids that happened. Now let's get back to the original reason most people came here from China in the first place. It was not for mistreatment, nor was it to gamble in Fantan Alley. It wasn't even to create Chinatown. They came in search of this. Gold. In 1849, there was a large gold rush in California. Well, many people from China had come over for that gold rush. Now, 10 years later, when the Hudson's Bay Company in Victoria sent almost 23 kilograms of gold, today that would be worth well over $500,000, to be sold in San Francisco, and a bunch of bored miners who were waiting around for the next big strike got wind of this. Guess who was on the next boat north to Victoria? Vancouver wasn't even around in those days. In fact, BC wasn't even around in those days. The official colony was Vancouver Island. The rest of BC was an area called New Caledonia. Now, Vancouver Island was under the control of this guy, Sir James Douglas. Now, Douglas had two jobs. First, he was chief factor, kind of a junior boss, of the Hudson's Bay Company, which in those days mostly dealt with furs, a slightly smaller product line than they do now. But that's another journey for another day. Secondly, he was governor of the colony of Vancouver Island. Now, Douglas's control did not extend to the mainland, but when large numbers of people came flooding in search for gold, he decided to decree that the gold was owned by the Crown and started issuing mining licenses, something he was not allowed to do, in order to control the flood of people coming in every day. You could buy a mining license right here on Wharf Street. And it wasn't just the Chinese who flooded into the sleepy little colony. Americans, British, Australians, Spanish, African Americans, Mexicans, people came from all over the world in search of fortune. This was a copy of a book published in England for people who wanted to come over for the gold rush. There's a lot to know about gold mining, especially if you've never done it before. Now, there are basically two different kinds of gold, and lots of different ways to get at it. The first kind of gold is called vein gold, because it works like veins going through rocks. This is the most difficult kind of gold to get at, because it usually requires chipping away at the rock, or more often, building a tunnel or a shaft, like this one, to dig in and get the gold. The second kind of gold deposit is the little bits of gold that have broken away from veins. This is called alluvial or placer gold. Placer meaning sandbank, because that's where it's usually found. Now, mining for placer gold involves a principle that gold is really, really heavy, much heavier than the dirt and sand that it's been mixed with. So what a miner would do is dig up shovelfuls of sand and dirt and put it into a device like this, called a sluice, or a smaller one called a rocker box. Now, what a miner would do is pour water or divert it from a river, and it would move along this sluice here, washing away the dirt and sand and leaving behind the gold. The gold was much heavier, so it would sink to the bottom and get stuck behind these little ridges here. Of course, if you were just starting out or you didn't want to build a big sluice like this, you could always do it the old-fashioned way. Pan it out. And what better place to try our luck at some panning than here, at Goldstream Park, just north of Victoria. Now, panning works similar to sluicing. Gold is really, really heavy, so it sinks to the bottom. Now here I have a specially designed gold pan. It's got long, sloping sides and little ridges here to catch the gold. But there's no reason you couldn't use an aluminum plate or something like that. So what you do is take a big scoop of sand and dirt. Get rid of the really big rocks. Now, gold will sink to the bottom. What we have to do is kind of swish it around like this. And gradually, the sand and water will come out. Until you're left with just the big rocks, and hopefully, maybe a little bit of gold. Most gold mining was not done on Vancouver Island. Generally, after leaving Victoria, a miner would make their way, by raft or canoe, and later steamship, over to the mainland to New Westminster, and then the Fraser River. As gold near the mouth of the Fraser ran out, miners continued upwards. Yale, Lytton, Lillooet, Boston Bar, Williams Lake, Quesnel, all of these towns and cities grew from the influence of the gold rush. A town that remembers the gold rush best is this one, Barkerville. Now, Barkerville was built around the claim of one William Billy Barker, who was an Englishman and had come over to North America for the California gold rush. Remember the one I mentioned earlier? Like many other miners, Barker made his way up the Fraser until he reached a place called Stout's Gulch. And in Stout's Gulch, Barker and his partners decided to dig a mine shaft. And on August 17, 1862, they made one of the largest strikes in gold rush history. In fact, the entire area was ripe with gold, and soon a village sprung up near the Barker claim to supply all the miners that were coming in to get a piece of the action. The village grew in a hurry, with residents starting off in tents and later establishing more permanent cabins. As in Victoria, a Chinatown emerged in Barkerville as Chinese miners and laborers arrived in the town. With people flooding up to the interior, transportation started to become a serious issue. It takes about 9 hours to get from Vancouver to Barkerville in a car along the highway. So you can just imagine how long it would take to get here in Barker's time. With no roads and no cars to get up here, you would travel by foot, mule, pack horse, or even camel. So between 1861 and 1865, the province helped build this, the Caribou Wagon Road, to make their trip less dangerous and to help more supplies get up to Barkerville. With continued gold strikes and help of the Caribou Wagon Road, at its peak, Barkerville's population numbered a little over 4,500 residents. Barker was definitely no longer alone. Now, in the winter of 1863, Barker went down to Victoria where he would meet the woman he would marry, Elizabeth Collier. The two got married right away, and that summer returned back to Barkerville, where Barker did a strange thing. He sold the claim that was still producing money. I guess he figured he'd made as much money as he could ever spend. It's estimated Barker pulled out $350,000 worth of gold. That's over $7 million in today's money. The two settled back in Victoria, where sadly Elizabeth died 2 years later in 1865. 2 years later, Barker's $350,000 was also gone. He went back to prospecting, but he never attained the kind of success that he had made in Barkerville. Barker's riches vanished quickly, and he eventually died of cancer, living out his last days penniless in an old men's home in Victoria. Which brings us back here, to Ross Bay Cemetery. Now the old men's home was just on the other side of the cemetery, and this is Barker's final resting place, where he was buried in 1894 in an unmarked grave. This plaque you see here wasn't put up until almost 70 years later. This gives us a good opportunity for a quick review. We started here at Ross Bay Cemetery looking at the graves, or lack of graves, of Chinese who came over in large numbers and built Victoria's Chinatown. At first, the Chinese came, along with people of many nationalities, in search of gold. Now, the governor of the colony of Vancouver Island, Sir James Douglas, was worried about the number of people flooding into the area and started to issue mining licenses, something he was not allowed to do. In the miners' search, they gradually moved up towards the heart of British Columbia, where small towns and communities sprouted up in their path. One of those towns was named Barkerville, after William Billy Barker, who struck it big, but still ended up back here, at the Ross Bay Cemetery. Well, with its large new population, growing towns and communities, plus more than a fair share of saloons popping up, a little law and order was required in BC. Also remember, this guy, Sir James Douglas, was trying to issue gold licenses on the mainland, something he was not allowed to do because he was only governor of the colony of Vancouver Island, not the mainland, which in those days was called New Caledonia. Enter on the scene this guy, Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie, who arrived in 1858, about the same time as the first Chinese immigrants. Now with him, Begbie brought some papers which declared Douglas as the governor of a new colony called British Columbia, which into those days had been New Caledonia, mostly the mainland. So now Douglas was governor of both British Columbia and the Vancouver Island colony. Now the papers also declared Begbie as the first judge of the new colony of British Columbia. Now Begbie's one of these figures in BC history who doesn't really get the recognition he deserves. In addition to being the only judge for all of British Columbia at the time, he also mapped large portions of BC, conducted detailed weather surveys, personally visited most of the mining camps so that he could try cases, learned several First Nations languages as well as a bit of Cantonese so he could better serve the people, got involved in politics, and advocated against the discrimination that was growing against the First Nations groups and the Chinese immigrants. However, despite all this, Judge Begbie's best known by his nickname, the Hanging Judge. Now, while it's true he did order a number of people hanged during his term as judge, and if there was a hanging to be done, it was often here, in what is now Bastion Square. the site of the old courthouse, which is now a maritime museum. Many people were publicly hung here under sentence from Judge Begbie, but his nickname seems to come more from myth and story rather than fact and history. The nickname the hanging judge was never used until after he was dead. And in those days, the prescribed punishment for someone convicted of murder was execution by hanging. Begbie's fairness opened up large doors in the fields of civil rights, and he was known for siding with the little guy. He had great respect for First Nations groups in BC, who faced growing discrimination from many British and American colonists, and felt a little awkward applying English laws to a culture that was so different from the British one. He even suggested setting up two different systems to deal with First Nations and non-First Nations crimes. But nevertheless, he had a job to do, and tried to dispense the law as fairly as possible. Begbie also held similar views towards Chinese immigrants, who he respected as valuable members of society. Racism towards the Chinese was present from the day they arrived, and was growing. When local and provincial governments tried to pass bylaws, taxes, and fees that discriminated against the Chinese, of which there were many, including extra mining license fees, extra taxes on Chinese businesses, and even a tax on just being Chinese, Begbie generally opposed them, or overturned them if he could. Begbie held a long and distinguished career as a judge of the colony of British Columbia, and then the province. In his latter years, he didn't roam the countryside so much, and preferred his home in Victoria, where he passed away on June 11, 1894. His funeral was a grand one, although his grave a simple one according to his wishes, despite his brother changing the wooden cross he requested to the stone cross you see here. Now Begbie is remembered here at Ross Bay Cemetery, as well as here, at the entrance to the legislative buildings, standing beside Douglas, showing the important role that Begbie played in BC history. Now most history books tend to play up the term hanging judge because it sounds exciting. I'll let you decide whether he deserves the nickname or not. Now I've shown you mostly the good aspects of Begbie's life, but not everyone always thought so highly of him, including this odd character here, who is also much glossed over in BC and Canadian history, and is most remembered for a name. Amor de Cosmos, which is an odd combination of Greek, French, and Latin. Was didn't always have this unusual name. He was born William Alexander Smith in Nova Scotia, and as chance would have it, he also happened to come to Victoria in 1858, along with Chinese immigrants and Judge Matthew Begbie. After leaving Nova Scotia, Cosmos had traveled to California for the gold rush of '49, where he'd made a fair bit of money buying and selling land. But in Victoria, he decided to start a newspaper. In December of 1858, the first copy of the British Colonist rolled off the presses, and BC was never the same again. The Colonist would later join with the Victoria Times and become the Times Colonist, which still runs today. The first issue laid out a scathing attack on Sir James Douglas. It wasn't that Cosmos held anything personal against Douglas, more that he was angered by the fact that Douglas held complete power in the colony. You see, back in Nova Scotia, Cosmos had been inspired by a man named Joseph Howe, who had worked to establish responsible government when Nova Scotia was also a British colony. Responsible government means that the people of an area get to choose who will be their leader. But that's really another journey for another day. Suffice it to say, Douglas was appointed by the British government, and some people, particularly Cosmos, didn't like the fact that Douglas had so much influence over the goings-on of the colony. And this finally prompted the British government to order Douglas to set up an elected assembly. However, Douglas was still in charge and didn't have to listen to the assembly. Which brings us back to Amor de Cosmos. Cosmos eventually decided to stop just picking on Douglas and other politicians through his newspaper, and ran for the assembly in order to make some changes. He ran twice and failed. However, in 1863, Cosmos ran again on two big issues of getting responsible government and uniting the two colonies of BC and Vancouver Island, which, if you remember, were still separate. And Cosmos won. A lot of people were looking forward to much headbutting between Cosmos and Douglas, but they were disappointed as shortly after the election, Douglas retired and was replaced by Governor Kennedy on the island and Governor Seymour in BC. Cosmos sold the British colonist newspaper and got to work at joining the two colonies. Well, he soon got his wish. In 1865, the gold rush had started to dwindle down, and both colonies were worried about the economic effects. They were also worried about the ability to afford two different governments. So in 1866, Queen Victoria gave her permission for the two colonies to join. Now the temporary capital was New Westminster, which was later changed to Victoria after much heated arguing. But that's another journey for another day. Cosmos was still unhappy though, as the uniting of the two colonies did not bring about responsible government. The united colony was still controlled by a governor. So Cosmos now turned his attention to getting responsible government, and also on something that was going on out east. You see, BC wasn't the only British colony in North America, and a few others out east, namely Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, were working towards joining together. Now at the time, despite the fact that the British and Americans had settled on the 49th parallel as the border, there was still lots of worries that the Americans might try to take BC anyway, especially since they had just bought Alaska from the Russians, but that's another journey for another day. Cosmos was determined to keep British Columbia British, and so in addition to responsible government, he sought to join BC with the Canadian Confederation that was formed on July 1st, 1867. A delegation was sent to Ottawa, but Cosmos, who wasn't particularly popular with the new governor, was chosen not to go. The BC delegation won better terms than they could have ever hoped for. They would have responsible government, Canada would take over all of BC's debts, and a railroad would be built within 10 years linking BC with the rest of Canada. BC officially became a province of Canada on July 20th, 1871. Cosmos then went off to Ottawa, where he became a member of Parliament to look after BC's interests in Canada. As there were no political parties in BC, a member of the Assembly named John McCreight was appointed as BC's first premier. The following summer, Cosmos returned to Victoria, where he managed to force McCreight to resign. Cosmos himself was then appointed as the second premier of BC. As premier, Cosmos was not a great success. In 1874, for a variety of reasons, Cosmos resigned as premier of BC. One of the reasons might have been that a group of angry citizens arrived at the legislature, guns and clubs drawn, threatening to hang Cosmos. Come on out, Cosmos! They were angry because 3 years had passed and there'd been almost no progress on a railroad that was supposed to finish in 10 years. One of the reasons for the delay was that this guy, Sir John A. Macdonald, Canadian Prime Minister, who was one of the biggest supporters of the railroad, got replaced by this guy, Alexander Mackenzie, who didn't want the railroad to go through. Well, Cosmos returned to Ottawa to fight for progress on the railroad, but it wasn't until Sir John A. Macdonald was later re-elected that the railroad began. Everything Cosmos worked towards had come true. But after he failed to win a seat in the 1882 election, he vanished from politics. Now, without a cause to fight for, Cosmos became lonely and depressed. He took to drinking and wandering the streets of Victoria. Now, he'd always been a little bit odd, but sadly he suffered from a mental breakdown in 1895. He died in 1897, almost totally forgot by the province and country he'd helped build. His funeral was attended by only a handful of people here at Ross Bay Cemetery. Cosmos did live to see his last crusade completed. The building of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, or CPR, was finished in 1885. It astonishingly took only 5 years to build. Now the CPR is another journey for another day, but I will say one thing about it. The BC section of the railroad was by far the most dangerous and difficult because it had to pass over the Rocky Mountains. The BC section would have not been completed if it weren't for the labor of Chinese immigrants. With the gold rush over, there were many Chinese in BC looking for work, and they were willing to work harder and for less money than European immigrants. The railroad was already costing much more than anyone had thought, and thousands more workers were brought over directly from China. Working conditions were hard and unsafe, and Chinese laborers were often given the most dangerous jobs. As a result, the railroad was finished, but hundreds and hundreds of workers died in order to complete it. Which brings us to the end of our journey, back here at Ross Bay Cemetery. As with most journeys, we end up where we started from. While most of the workers who died on the railroad were buried near the railroad, some I'm sure made it back to Victoria and were laid to rest either here or at Harling Point. In our journey, we started off at Ross Bay Cemetery looking at the Chinese graves. The graves were here because of all the Chinese immigrants who had built Chinatown. The Chinese first came, along with many others, in search of gold, which in turn helped create many of the cities we now have in BC, and gave us some famous figures such as Billy Barker, who's also buried in Ross Bay Cemetery. At the same time, Judge Begbie arrives to keep law and order in the growing colony and influence many decisions that were made in the early days of BC history. Again, buried in Ross Bay Cemetery. Another person to influence many decisions in BC and Canadian history was Amorta Cosmos, who wasn't always the most popular guy, but whose impact was great, again buried in Ross Bay Cemetery. Cosmos was instrumental in getting BC into confederation with Canada, and influenced the creation of the railroad, which was built largely with Chinese labor in BC, many of whom died during its construction. Now before we go, I want to point out the fact that we haven't met very many women on our journey today. This is not to say that there haven't been a lot of great contributions by women to BC history, just that we didn't meet any on our particular journey. Mostly because during the period of time we've been talking about, there weren't a lot of women in BC. In 1881, women made up less than 25% of the non-native population. Here at Ross Bay Cemetery, you can see the graves of a lot of great women who have made many contributions to BC history. But that's another journey for another day. We've been many places and met a lot of interesting people on our journey here today, but don't let it end here. There's been lots of stops where you could get off on a completely different direction. So go ahead and make your own journey. After all, it's one big world out there.
Here we go. Take notice of the cans arranged to date. They've all been punctured and exhausted.